Before we're done with section 5.1, we have just a couple more definitions to look over. So objective 4, which is simulation, I just want to kind of mention it real quickly because it is an important topic for later work in statistics. A lot of times we want an empirical probability. We want a probability about a real situation based on data. But for whatever reason, it's impractical or possibly dangerous to obtain the real data. So for example, what are the death rates in a future tsunami, or what are the death rates in a future earthquake? And so scientists will create models and kind of have fake tsunamis or fake earthquakes in those models, and then computers will judge what's going on, or they'll have lasers pointing at things and they can try to figure out what the situation is. Or they're watching the settlement of the cathedrals in Europe, and they'll go in with like laser counters and have computers figure out the probability of this church collapsing in the next 100 years or so. You can't actually go collapse the church. That's dangerous and crazy. So what you'll do is you'll have the computer simulate what are possible circumstances, tectonically speaking, in this area. What are the chances of this particular cathedral collapsing that was built in the Middle Ages? That kind of thing. So those are simulations. They're really important. There's sort of empirical probabilities that you'd be calculating, but they're empirical probabilities not based on real data, but on computer generated data for whatever reason, because it would be too impractical or too dangerous to create the situation in real life. All right, that leads us to subjective probabilities. Now, a probability expresses, a subjective probability, expresses the opinion or degree of belief about how likely a particular event is to occur. So it's not from experiment, it's not replicable events. See, empirical probability is based off of data. So I have past experience that perfectly relates or perfectly captures or replicates this event. Subjective probability is when you don't have that past data that perfectly replicates your current situations. It means that past experiment is really what you're interested in. So a lot of life's experiments are not perfectly repeatable, and since they're not perfectly repeatable, that's more subjective probability, not an empirical probability. Now, the line between subjective and empirical does get a little fuzzy as we get more and more data, more and more simulations involved, etc. But subjective is technically what's being in play anytime we try to make an educated guess about the chances of something based off of experience, knowledge, that kind of thing, but not really based off of past data. Right? Now, these are perfectly legitimate. Matter of fact, sometimes they're the only thing you've got as your option. But obviously, because they're not based on past data, because they're based on opinion and degree of belief, they might not be as accurate, say, as classical or empirical. All right, so let's look at these three. Now remember, classical is the theoretical probability, and it was based in gambling ideas in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, post-Renaissance, I should say. And then empirical means it comes from data, but the past data or current data, but the data has to be, the probability experiment has to be the same or similar to the experiment of your current situation. And then subjective is more an opinion when it's a non-replicable event. All right, so a friend tells you there's a 60% chance they will be attending Julie's party this week. So you say, hey, you going to Julie's party? Nah, I'm not sure, maybe a 60% chance I'll be there. Of course, why you would be talking like that when Julie's such a good friend to you, I don't know. But that is a subjective probability. That is not based on past data. That is you making an educated guess. All right. Now, the Red Cross in Jackson, I've actually been in touch with them. They keep track of the blood types of everyone that donates blood in Jackson County or Jackson College's monthly blood drives. So we have monthly blood drives at the college, and they keep track of it. They want to know, how many people are this, how many people are that. In particular, they're always interested in O negative, and all you future nursing students might know why, because the O negative is the universal donor, right? So that was based on past data. There we go. So based on past data, as far as we can tell, about 8% of the local population has O negative blood. That's the universal donor, so they very much want to have that on hand at any kind of trauma center or emergency room. All right. So the probability of rolling a sum of 7 or 11 on two 6-sided dice, which is an automatic win in craps, by the way. So if you roll 7 or 11 on your first roll, you automatically win. That is very much a classical probability. You didn't actually go and roll the dice. You based it on theory, not on actual rolls. Right? You didn't go to the casino and gamble, gamble, gamble. You just imagine it and say, well, there's 36 sides, 8 of them are 7 or some to 7 or 11, so there we go. All right, a researcher administers a new drug to cancer patients, and the proportion of people for whom it worked is counted. The probability that the new drug is effective for new patients is determined from these numbers. Oh, drug companies do this all the time. So they use their past data from a trial, from a clinical trial. So using data from a clinical trial to create probabilities. And those probabilities are what the doctors and nurses who say, hey, you have a such and such chance of this being effective, they're basing that off of that past data from that drug company. So that's empirical. All right, during the World Series of Poker, which I will admit to enjoying watching every once in a while on ESPN2. So when you watch it, and you can look it up on ESPN or you can look it up on YouTube, you'll see that when they show the hand, there's a little camera in the table, and then the camera can show the 2 cards, and then automatically it'll say, the person's name, the gambler's name, and then it'll say 88%. And what that means is that they have an 88% chance of winning. That is classical, right? It is based on theory of cards, and the computer, what happens is the ESPN just has a computer already set up, so it knows every possible combination, and it has all the classical probabilities automatically figured out. And just for the record, each card was assumed to be equally likely, right? At least at the beginning. Of course, we know that as poker hands get dealt out, the probabilities are changing, but we know that it was based on the theory regarding the deck of cards. How about that? Let's just leave it at that. So that's very much a theoretical probability. All right, now a commentator on CNBC states that they think next year's unemployment rate will be 5.4%. That is subjective. You'll get that on all those kinds of channels. The CNBC, I believe, is the business channel. And so they'll say, well, next year, I think, based on these factors, that it's going to become 5.4%. That is very much subjective. It's based on the reporter's opinion, or this would be a commentator's opinion. Although they've done some studies, and some commentators are better than others. And the funny thing is that nobody ever holds them to account for when they are right or wrong, which is a whole discussion for another time, and perhaps a media course that you might take. All right, I hope that helps with understanding the difference between subjective, empirical, and classical. Classical is the literally classic, based on everything is equally likely. We can kind of hypothetically figure it all out, right? Gambling ideas, that kind of stuff. Empirical is when I use past data, but it has to be a replicable event. And subjective is when it's not replicable. So for example, unemployment rate, because so many factors affect the economy, that's not empirical, that's subjective, right? Because there's too many things going on in an economy to use past data to perfectly replicate what's going on. So that's a subjective, educated guess opinion.